Welcome to Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is exclusively dedicated to Web API, Web API, and Web API. When you're talking about ASP.NET interviews, there is a 1001% guarantee that you will be questioned around Web API. So this is a 30 minutes of video. In this, we are covering approximately 10 to 11 questions. So we'll first talk about what is Web API, what is the connection between Web API and REST. So REST questions are surely asked when you talk about Web API. We'll talk about Web API versus MVC, Web API versus WCF. We'll talk about how to secure your Web API and so on. So in this 30 minutes exclusively, we are focusing around Web API. So let us get started. Explain Web API. What is the need of Web API? Web API is nothing but it is an MVC controller. So you can see here is a code of Web API. So Web API is an MVC controller. So if you go to add a controller, you will find that there are two kinds of controller, the MVC and the API. So this is an API controller which helps to expose data over HTTP. The only goal of Web API is to expose your services, your data over HTTP. Now, HTTP is a very time-proven protocol. It's a very old protocol. It's a standard protocol, and it is trusted by many people. It is used by many people. The whole World Wide Web works on HTTP. So once you expose your services over HTTP, right, it can be consumed by anyone. So either your client can be a simple browser, or either your client can be a mobile app, or it can be any JavaScript app, using React or Angular, right? Anyone can consume your service, because you are exposing your service through HTTP, which is almost a 50 years old protocol, a time-proven protocol. So the goal of Web API is to make available your services through HTTP, and by doing so, it can be consumed in disparate platforms. It can be consumed anywhere. Many interviewers would be satisfied, by hearing that yes, Web API helps you to implement HTTP services. But, when you're talking about senior positions, or when you're talking about some of those interviewers, who want to know the connection between Web API and the REST principles. And even as a candidate, if you want to raise your bar higher of the interview, then I think, you should talk about the connection between Web API and REST, right? So one of the answers, which can really impress the interviewer is that Web API helps you to implement REST principles. But remember that once you say that, once you utter the word REST, then you should be able to explain it, right? So let us try to understand what exactly is this REST, and how does the Web API controller satisfies the REST principles, right? So as I said that REST is a principle. REST is an architectural style. Look at my answer. REST is an architectural style. In case if you can't say the word architectural style, must be REST is a principle. So this REST stands for representational state transfer. Just big words, nothing. Representational state transfer. So what does the REST principle says? REST principle says that you can have a resource. So at the right hand side, I'm writing down here, you can have a resource. Now this resource can be anything. It can be a database. It can be a database data, right? It can be an HTML page. It can be an image. It can be a video. It can be an XML file, an Excel file, or any kind of text file. So, there are different kind of resources out here, right? Different kind of data out here. So what REST says is that for this data, we should have a representation. Remember, I'm not talking about the actual data, and representation. For example, now if this is a text file, so there will be a representation out here. So, a representation. Now this representation can be XML. This representation can be JSON. For example, now let us say that this text file is exposed in a representation of a JSON. So for example, let's say in that text file you have name, right? So let's say this is the way it is exposed out, right? So it is exposed as JSON. So JSON is one of the representations. You can have XML, you can have CSV, right? So this is the representation and this is the state, so you can, like, for example, you can say this is name Shiv, and let us say that this Shiv has bought, this Shiv has an age, right? So I'll say, okay, age is whatever, 50. Okay. So this is the state. This data is the state. This data is the state. So there is representation of the data, right? So the table can also be represented in JSON. The HTML can be represented in XML, right? So there's a representation and there is a state, the data itself, right? So REST says that if you can decouple your actual data from a representation and the state, right? And if you are able to transfer this, then you can have a nice client server model. So this is the client. Now, what does the client know? The client knows only representation. He does not know at the back end there is a text file or, there is a database or there is a HTML, right? So he just knows that, okay, like this is what I should know, name and the age. And if the client wants to say that, okay, go and modify the name, then probably he will also send a representation. He will say that something like this, okay, name modified to Raju, right? And action is update. Now, this is also a representation. Again, at the left hand side, this can be a button click. This can be a browser event. This can be some kind of an event which happened in a mobile app, right? We don't know. But this action out here now has a representation. So you can see now there's a clear decoupling here. There's a clear decoupling. At the right side, you can say this is your server, right? But again, I would like to tie it up again with the server. Right? At the right hand side, it can be anyone who wants to provide data, right? So at the right side, you have these resources, you have this data which can be in disparate format. At the left side, you will have this client, right? But now because they are talking in representation and state, they are completely decoupled from each other. So the concept of REST is that REST is an architectural style, wherein we talk in terms of representation. So the server table, it will be represented in JSON. The server text file or an image can be represented in XML. The client's action can be represented in representation. So representations and state are used to communicate between the client and the server. So this is a concept. Now understand this. This is a concept. Now how this can be easily implemented? This can be easily implemented by using HTTP. And how can HTTP be easily implemented? By using Web API. So as soon as you go and you add that controller out there, this Web API, right? Automatically that representations, that the state and everything is handled. So one is, the REST says, talk in terms of representation. The client sends a representation, the server sends a representation. And with that, the client and server are decoupled. But at the same time, this REST API also puts down some architectural constraints. This is the Wikipedia page of REST, right? I don't want to make this a big gaga story. Remember, this is an interview question series and not a step-by-step video, right? For the step-by-step video, please go and see our step-by-step video of MVC core, right? So there are some architectural constraints as well, so you say that, okay, like I want to follow REST principles. I want to make my system RESTful, right? So I want to talk in terms of representation, but that is not enough. So there are some constraints. The first thing is client server, right? Client server means the client has no idea of the server data types. The server does not have idea that this is a mobile type of a client or a JavaScript client, right? So that is the first constraint. The second one, very important one, statelessness. The client and server shouldn't be maintaining each other's state, right? It should be the part of the representation. So for example, now the client sends a representation saying increment counter. The server will say, okay, here it is 1 plus 1 is 2, right? He sends to the client and he also sends the 2 to him saying, okay, this is the 2 to you, right? The next time when the client comes in, In the representation itself, we will say, see, my previous value was 2. Now, how do we do it in HTTP? By using cookie, by using, query string, we try to, or hidden fields, we maintain the value. So inside the representation itself, there is a state. Remember, the full form is representational state transfer. So the state is the part of the representation, but as such, the protocol itself, should be stateless. And that's why HTTP is a very widely used thing, when it comes to REST, because HTTP is stateless. Now there is here something called as cacheability, etc., but leave it for now. I'll come to the most important part. Please understand, these other concepts are important, but as I've said that this is an interview question video, so I don't want to get into those concepts out here, right? But there are some other concepts. Uniform interface. In uniform interface, the architectural constraint is that resource should be identified by an URL or by, some kind of there should be some kind of a unique identification of that resource. So when you look at HTTP, we have the URL, right? Resource manipulation should happen through representation. So when you look at your HTTP protocol, so if you see here in inspect, whenever you send data out here, right, you always send representations, so if you look at your header, so in HTTP, right, you can see now here we are saying request method get. So we are saying that we want to get the data. We want to post the data, right? So not only we are sending data right here, we are also sending what actions to be done. So what it is saying is that even the client will send the resource manipulation in representation. Now again in HTTP, we have the request headers, we have the response headers, we have the context, right? So that makes again HTTP a very good candidate for REST. Again, you can see self-descriptive message. Each message should hold enough information on how to process the data. For example, in HTTP, you can say that, okay, I want to go and see this data in XML. I want to go and see the data in JSON. I want to go and see this data in English, EN-US, EN-UK, or Hindi, or whatever, right? So again, the messages should be self-descriptive so that the server can process it, right? So if you look at all this REST principles, right, and the architectural constraints, statelessness, client server, resource should be identified, manipulation should happen through representation. There is no other guy who can satisfy the REST principles in a clear-cut way, and that is the HTTP protocol, right? So if we follow HTTP, then we are following REST principles. Very simple. So remember, in the interview, you don't have to say this big gaga story, which I've said in the last 10 minutes. Let me just summarize. What is Web API? Web API helps you to implement your services or expose your services and data through HTTP. Web API helps you to implement REST. What is REST? REST is an architectural style, where we talk in terms of representation and states. And there are some constraints of REST, like it should be stateless, there should be a unique identifier. Remember, I'm not going through all of the principles, right? All the other principles are also satisfied by HTTP. I'm just saying that in the interview, you can't have a big gaga story, right? So resources are identified, the resource manipulation happen through representation, self-descriptive messages. So all of these things, HTTP protocol says that, right? So if we follow HTTP, we are following REST. So that's why a lot of people say Web API controller implements REST architectural style. Web API helps you to create a RESTful service. So in the interview, what you can do is you can start by saying that Web API helps you to create REST HTTP services. In case the interviewer goes into REST, then try to explain him in short, that how in REST people, the protocol talks, how the principle talks of, talking in terms of representation, the statelessness, the unique URL, self-descriptive messages, and so on. Keep it short and sweet, not like a gaga story, which I've said in the last 10 minutes that can really take the interview into something else, right? So here it is on the screen. I'm just flashing the answers, of the web API and also the connection with the REST principles. Can we expose our data and services over web API using TCP protocol or some other protocol? The answer is absolutely no. REST API says that whatever medium you use to transport data should be stateless, and TCP IP or some other protocols can be stateful, right? So that's why web API does not allow you to implement any other protocol other than HTTP. What's the difference between the normal MVC controller and the web API controller? Now the interviewer is now taking you into the twist and the turns kind of questions, right? So what's the difference between the normal MVC controller and the web API controller, right? So if you look at your normal MVC controller, this is your normal MVC controller. The first thing is, if you look at this normal MVC controller, it inherits from the controller class. This is, I'm talking about .NET Core, MVC Core 3.x. Now in case of 5, it could have changed, but the concept should be same almost, So here it is, you can see it is inheriting from the controller, while the web API controller is inheriting from controller base. So that means that both of them are quite different, right? But now from the interview perspective, how should we answer it? First thing, as I've been saying till now, that web API exposes only services and data through representations, right? It does not say that I will return a view like an HTML view or a UI. It just says I will return you JSON, I will return you XML, right? But in case of your normal MVC controller, you can return a view, an HTML. While in case of a normal web API controller, you can't return a view. So the first big difference is MVC controller returns view. You can say return view out here, but in case of web API, you can see here we are saying nothing. We are just saying we are returning data, we are returning value. We are not saying anything because this web API will automatically evaluate depending on the client, what kind of data to be sent, right? So the first difference is if you want to return a view, web API is not capable for it, right? But now please note, the interviewer is not leaving you, right? So now let us say the interviewer can cross question you, or he can say that, let us say that I am not returning any view from the normal controller. So all my views are in Angular or they are in React, right? So I'm not returning any view. So let us say if I say return JSON here, you can see now this normal MVC controller is returning JSON. And you can see this web API is also returning data, and by default it returns JSON. So you can see here, when I hit this is the web API, it is returning JSON. When I'm hitting the normal controller, it is now returning JSON. So now the interviewer can cross question you saying that now what is the difference? Now let us say if I am returning out here JSON, and here by default he is returning JSON, the web API is returning JSON. So now what's the difference? Because this is also, if I make a get call, it is returning JSON. Here also, if I make a get call, it is returning JSON, and also must be when we make a post call and a put call, it would be the one and the same thing. So now what is the difference, right? So now remember I said that web API follows HTTP religiously. It follows REST principles, right? One of the things of the REST principles was that depending on the representation what we send, the server should react. So for example, now you can see that this is over here, this will always return JSON. This code out here, irrespective, if the client says no, like I want XML, he will not return you XML because this is like hard coded. It is JSON. But now when it comes to web API, if you see here, he is just returning data. Now this has to be sent in JSON or what? It looks at the representation. It looks at the request headers. So if you see out here, it says in the accept, this accept is one of the request headers of HTTP protocol. It says that, see, I understand HTML, I understand XML, I understand so many other things, right? So depending on that, he has sent him JSON, right? But now if I go and if I change this, you can see here I've installed a mod header. I will not go into what this does, what this mod header is, but this mod header will help. I'm going to go and change my request header here. I will say that as a client, I understand only application / XML. Now, if you see, if I send a request out here, you can see now it is sending XML. Look at this. If I see in the value now, I modified my headers. So in the value, I'm saying, as a client, I understand XML, he is giving him XML. As a client, I understand JSON, he is giving me JSON. But when I see out here in the normal controller, it is not. It is still sending me JSON. This is termed as content negotiation. Content negotiation means depending on the client, the web API now reacts. Depending on the data what is sent in the header, the web API reacts automatically. And why does it react automatically? Because it is trying to follow the HTTP protocol. In the HTTP protocol, if you are sending him XML, he will act according to that, right? So, even if you are returning JSON from both of the controllers, still web API, has an upper hand because it follows REST API. It has content negotiation. It has this post, get, put, delete. It implements HTTP services religiously. While in case of MVC, now you have to go and write all that code out here. So remember that as a best practice, whenever you say you want to expose data, it is always web API. When you want to load any kind of a view, like a Razor view, it is always MVC controller. So the distinction is very, very clear out here. What's the difference between WCF and web API? Now, WCF is an legacy technology, or I'll say it was launched during .NET 3.0 framework. So in case if you are a fresher, in case you are like having 1 or 2 years of experience, probably you can get away from this question by saying that you never worked with WCF. But people who are seniors, people who have worked at least 5 or 6 years with .NET framework, you should be able to answer something around WCF and web API. So point number 1, WCF implemented service-oriented architectural style. So the whole goal of WCF was to implement SOA. Now, let us try to understand that what exactly this SOA means. Now, SOA means it is an architectural style, or it is a thought process in which, we define how two services which are created in disparate technology can talk, integrate with each other. So for example, you have an accounting application which is created in Java, and then you have an inventory application which is created in .NET. How can they communicate to each other? So in SOA, what they say is that the two services can talk by using well-defined XML. So you can see here, this is a very simple project of WCF, right? You can see that the client, can send a request, or I'll say one service can send a request in XML. So this is XML, and the other service can respond in terms of XML. So in short, the way web API helps to implement REST architectural style, WCF helps to implement service-oriented architectural style. So let us start point-wise. Point number 1, WCF implements service-oriented architecture style. And the goal of SOA was that if you have two services like accounting project which is created in Java and inventory project which is created in .NET, and you want to go and integrate them, then you use SOA, right? So the goals were very different. If you look at REST, or I will say web API implements REST. In REST, it is more about client server. See, in WCF also you can make a client and a server, but it was not meant for that. Please understand it, right? So when you talk about REST, when you talk about web API, it was about that how we can create decoupled clients, decoupled client and server. So the client has no idea of the server has no idea of the client. So this is the first point. One implements SOA, another implements REST. Point number 2, in WCF, you communicate using XML. So you can see here, you communicate using XML. XML is like mandatory when it comes to WCF or when it comes to SOA. But in case of REST or in case of web API, it is more representational. In REST, he does not say that, oh, you have to implement JSON, you have to implement XML. It's more on content negotiation. So you can create your own representation. There is no problem. So when it comes to Web API or REST, there is no fixed format. Definitely JSON is the most wide format because it is so simple, right? But at the end of the day, they don't try to enforce you inside a format. And the third important point, which I find, which is very important, is when it comes to WCF, you can host WCF in different protocols. Means if you see here, this is a WCF project. In case you want to learn WCF, please go and see my WCF step-by-step videos. So here you can see I can host on HTTP, I can host on MSMQ, I can host on TCP, right? So WCF is, does not stick to HTTP, or SOA does not say that you stick to HTTP, right? But when it comes to Web API, it is always HTTP. So in the interview, what you can do is that try to bring out these 3 points. Point number one is meant for SOA, another is meant for REST. One enforces XML, another says that you can define your own representation. Definitely JSON is the most common format, but you can also use XML. The third one, very important, any protocol, if you want, you can use in WCF, right? There is no rule that it has to be stateful. But when it comes to REST, when it comes to Web API, it is always HTTP. Also, there can be one googly question around here. What is the difference between WCF, REST and Web API? Now, this WCF was created mainly for SOA, that is service-oriented architecture, right? But later on, when the REST principle started picking up, Microsoft implemented something called as WCF REST. Means you can take your current WCF service and make it REST enabled, right? So one question can come in that, okay, so we have WCF REST and Web API. Remember that WCF REST was like a patchwork, or I will say it was like upgrading your existing WCF services to REST. Think about it. WCF was almost there around 7 to 8 years. So in 7 to 8 years, so many services were created, and suddenly, clients like JavaScript or, simple clients, they wanted REST. So you can't go and convert the old project in one night, right? So Microsoft implemented something called as WCF REST, so that the current WCF service can be used to implement REST API. But at the end of the day, Web API was built from scratch. Web API's only one goal was to implement REST, to implement HTTP services. So if you are doing a new project, you will always use Web API, right? So in case if you're starting a project today and if you want to implement REST, it is always Web API. But if you have an existing project of WCF and it is communicating using XML and the client is not able to consume it and you want to implement REST, then you use WCF REST. So WCF REST is for existing WCF projects. For new projects, always use Web API. How can you return status code and data through Web API? So to return status code and data through Web API, you can say return status code. So you can see the syntax here, status code. Now this has to be iAction. This has to be iAction result. So you can see here now, this is return status code. So this is status. This is an enum actually. So we can go and there are lots of other status code, like 404 and so on. But now let us say this is a happy situation. Everything is successful. So it will be 200. Okay. And then the data. Now at this moment, the data is a string, but it can be an object. It can be a complex data type, right? So we use this syntax to return status code as well as the data. Now for OK, there is a shortcut as well. Please remember. So rather than writing these big lines of code, you can also say here OK like this. So there is a shortcut as well. When you have an error, which is the status code, which is the best status code to return or to represent? So if you have an internal error or if you have an internal business validation failure, right? Normally developers use 500 internal server error. So 500 internal server error is a right way to represent any kind of validation failures. With new JavaScript frameworks like Angular and React, how is the current Web API integrated, or how is Web API integrated? So Web API is integrated in a completely client-server manner. The Angular project or the React project or whatever is your mobile app, right? They are completely different solution altogether. They are deployed separately. They can be hosted separately if needed, right? And only through HTTP calls are made to Web API. So Web API project only delivers data, data using HTTP RESTful fundamentals. So must be they will be using JSON or XML, whatever kind of data type, right? So if you look at today's modern architecture, Angular and React UI or whatever is the UI is completely separate, deployed separately, maintained separately. Even you can go ahead and you can have a different team for it separately, right? While the Web API project is completely different, hosted separately. It's meant for server side and the communication happens purely using HTTP between them. So that brings us to the end of chapter 5. Happy job hunting, happy learning. Also with this, we have a interview question ebook, one-liner ebook. I would suggest that please download the ebook and also start revising. So see the video, look at the PDF, see the video, look at the PDF. Happy job hunting, happy learning. Thank you.